him the title of the rational man, while branding his nephew Ludwig II as the Mad King. On the cold pages of official decrees, the distinction seems absolute. On one side, Prince Regent Luitpold, pragmatic, disciplined, the savior of the budget. On the other, a dreamer who bankrupted the state to build stone fantasies and converse with the dead. Luitpold acted in the name of sanity to crush the beautiful chaos of the king. He acted in the name of stability to suffocate a dream. In his lifetime, the rational man won the throne. But history possesses a dark, twisting sense of irony. Today, millions of pilgrims travel from every corner of the earth to Bavaria. They do not come to gaze upon the efficient barracks or the balanced ledgers of Luitpold's sanity, the very efficiency that eventually marched Germany into the industrial slaughter of the First World War. They come instead to stand in awe before Neuschwanstein, the madman's dream. Luitpold's rationality paved the road to a dynasty's extinction, while Ludwig's insanity gifted the world with eternal beauty. Standing in the shadow of those castles, one is forced to ask the terrifying question, in a tragedy that ends in blood and silence, who was the true madman after all? To understand how Luitpold could wait in the wings for 65 years, only to emerge as absolute master of the state, we must understand the world that produced him, the Biedermeier era of 19th century Germany, a time defined by a collective psychological craving for order and stability following the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars. Born in 1821, Luitpold was a child of this yearning for quiet, growing up in a Bavaria that was a beautiful paradox. It was a fiercely independent Catholic kingdom of the South, obsessed with Baroque art and a slower pace of life, yet it existed in the terrifying shadow of Prussia. To the north, Prussia was a nightmare of industrial efficiency and militaristic ambition, forcing Bavaria into a precarious diplomatic high-wire act to maintain its identity against the hungry giant. The ruling Wittelsbachs family, however, were often dangerously detached from this harsh political reality, preferring to build museums and compose poetry rather than read diplomatic cables. Into this environment, Luitpold was born as the classic spare, the third son of King Ludwig I, destined from his first breath to be a mere insurance policy for the dynasty. While his brilliant brother Maximilian was the son around which the family revolved, Luitpold's job was simply to exist, to be loyal, and never to threaten the throne. He performed this role with terrifying perfection for decades, becoming a fixture of the monarchy, solid, dependable, and largely ignored in the background of royal photographs. Yet beneath this unassuming exterior lay the steel of a professional soldier. Unlike his volatile artistic relatives, Luitpold found comfort in the rigid geometry of the parade ground and the clarity of military hierarchy. He didn't just wear the uniform, he climbed the ranks to become field marshal and inspector general, forging deep ties with the men who actually controlled the physical force of the state. With a solid marriage to the Habsburgs and the support of the rural gentry, Luitpold spent his life quietly observing the failures of his kin, a man of profound competence and patience waiting in the shadows, ready to step in when the fairy tale crumbled. Then, in 1864, the first domino fell in the long chain of events that would lead Luitpold to power. King Maximilian II died prematurely at the age of 52. The throne passed to Maximilian's eldest son, Luitpold's nephew, a tall, devastatingly handsome 18-year-old boy named Ludwig. And that is when the real trouble began. That is when the tectonic plates of Luitpold's world began to shift. We all think we know Ludwig II. He has been turned into the ultimate kitsch icon of Bavaria, the Swan King, the fairy tale king, the man who discovered and bankrolled Richard Wagner, changing the course of music history, the man who built Neuschwanstein, the castle that inspired Disney. He is remembered as a tragic romantic hero, a sensitive soul crushed by the cruel realities of politics, a man who wanted to live inside a Germanic myth rather than in the dreary world of parliaments and budgets. But in 1864, to the 43-year-old Prince Luitpold, this 18-year-old king was not a romantic hero. He was a terrifying liability. From the very beginning of Ludwig II's reign, there was a fundamental conflict of personalities between uncle and nephew that would grow into a lethal political antagonism. Luitpold was a man grounded in the mud and blood of reality. He understood that Bavaria's survival depended on a strong army, careful finances, and very cautious diplomacy with Prussia. Ludwig II, from the moment he put on the crown, seemed determined to ignore reality entirely. He was beautiful, yes, he was intelligent, certainly, but he was utterly tragically unsuited to be a constitutional monarch in the industrial age. He hated Munich. He hated the politicians with their endless discussions about taxes and infrastructure. He hated the public duties of being king, the parades, the speeches, the shaking of hands. Almost immediately, the teenage king began to withdraw. He retreated to his estates in the foothills of the Alps. He began to sleep all day and live at night, taking long solitary rides in gilded sleighs under the moon. He became obsessed with the operas of Wagner, seeing himself as a character in a Grail romance rather than the chief executive of a modern state. For the first few years, Luitpold watched this behavior perhaps with the affectionate, frustrated concern of an uncle. He tried to guide the young king. He tried to instill some sense of military discipline and political responsibility in him. But the gap between them was unbridgeable. Luitpold was a man who counted every single pfennig. He believed in fiscal responsibility as a moral imperative. Ludwig II was a man who had absolutely no concept of money. To Ludwig, money was simply a tool to realize his artistic visions, and if the treasury didn't have it, it should simply be borrowed. As the years went by, Luitpold's concern hardened into icy, implacable disapproval. He watched as Ludwig began his great building projects, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, and the soaring, incredibly expensive dream of Neuschwanstein. To the world today, these are masterpieces. To Luitpold, the inspector general of the army sitting in Munich looking at the ledgers, these were not artistic triumphs. They were evidence of a criminal dereliction of duty. Every million marks spent on gold leaf for a castle bedroom that no one would ever see was a million marks not spent on new rifles for the army that might have to defend Bavaria against Prussia. The tension in Munich grew year by year. The political class, the ministers, the generals, the pragmatic men in frock coats, whom Luitpold had known and networked with for decades, began to despair. They had a king who refused to live in the capital, a king who communicated with his government via frantic, impulsive notes written in purple ink, delivered by couriers in the middle of the night, a king who threatened to fire his entire cabinet if they didn't find him more money for his personal debts. By the mid-1880s, the situation was becoming critical. Ludwig was massively, ruinously in debt to private banks across Europe. There were dark rumors that he was soliciting loans from foreign powers, perhaps even France, Germany's arch-enemy, in exchange for compromising Bavarian independence. To Luitpold, the disciplined patriot, this was no longer just eccentric behavior. It was treason against the dynasty and the state. The king was endangering the very existence of the kingdom he had sworn to protect. The whispers began in the plush, smoke-filled drawing rooms of the Wittelsbachs Palais in Munich. The leading figures of the government, men who had been serving the state for 30 years, began to quietly approach Prince Luitpold. They all knew the problem. The king had to be stopped. The spending had to cease. The erratic behavior had to be reined in before Prussia used it as an excuse to intervene and swallow Bavaria whole. But the problem in a monarchy is that you cannot simply fire a king. He rules by divine right. He is anointed by God. To remove him is a cataclysmic act that shakes the very foundations of the state. Unless, of course, the king is mad, if the king is mentally incapacitated, if he is no longer a rational actor, then the Constitution provides a remedy. A regent can be appointed to rule in his stead. And so the architecture of the coup began to take shape in the spring of 1886. It was a conspiracy of the sane against the dreamer. It was methodical, bureaucratic, and ruthless. And at the very center of it, the man whose agreement was absolutely necessary, the only man with the moral authority and military backing to make it work, was the 65-year-old eternal spare, Prince Luitpold. He had waited a lifetime in the shadows. Now the state was calling on him to take control, but the price of power would be the destruction of his brother's son. The conspiracy that coalesced in the spring of 1886 was not a spontaneous uprising of the people. It was a cold, bureaucratic strangulation orchestrated by the very men sworn to serve the king, with Prince Luitpold standing silently at the apex of the pyramid. The mechanism they chose to remove Ludwig II was terrifying in its modernity. They did not opt for a palace coup involving swords and poison, the way their medieval ancestors might have done. They chose the weapon of the 19th century, psychiatry, to justify the deposition of a divinely anointed monarch. Luitpold and his ministers needed scientific proof that the king was no longer a person, but a medical liability. The task fell to Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, the director of the Munich Asylum and a man widely considered the father of German psychiatry. Gudden was a man of science, a man of the Enlightenment, and yet he agreed to produce a diagnosis that violated every ethical standard of his profession. He agreed to declare the king insane without ever speaking to him, without ever examining him, without ever setting foot in the same room as him. Instead of a clinical examination, the evidence was compiled through a grotesque dragnet of gossip. Agents of the ministry, working under the tacit authority of Prince Luitpold, interviewed disgruntled servants who had been fired by the king. They collected whispers from courtiers who felt slighted. They gathered the most humiliating, intimate, and often exaggerated details of the king's private life and pasted them together into a dossier of madness. They cataloged his behavior with the clinical detachment of entomologists studying a rare beetle. They noted that the king bowed to a certain tree in the forest as if it were a person. They recorded that he often ordered dinner for 12 people, dead French kings like Louis XIV and Louis XV, and then ate alone, conversing with the empty chairs. They noted his obsession with the color blue, his frantic demands for money, and his violent outbursts when his architectural dreams were thwarted. They cited his shy and retreating nature not as a personality trait, but as a symptom of advanced paranoia. In early June 1886, Dr. Gudden presented this report to the government. It was a masterpiece of hearsay, a medical assassination based on the testimony of stable boys and valets. But for Luitpold, it was the key to the kingdom. It gave him the legal cover he needed. He wasn't stealing the throne, he was saving the state from a lunatic. On June 10, 1886, the trap was sprung. In Munich, Prince Luitpold issued a proclamation declaring that, due to the tragic and incurable illness of his nephew, he was assuming the regency. It was a breathtaking act of political confidence. The king had not yet been informed. The king had not yet been arrested. He was still sitting in his castle in the mountains, technically the absolute ruler of Bavaria, while in the capital, his uncle was already printing the stationery of the new regime. Luitpold did not wait for the body to be cold. He did not even wait for the body to be captured. The first attempt to secure the king was a fiasco that bordered on comic opera, a collision between the bureaucratic arrogance of Munich and the fierce feudal loyalty of the Bavarian countryside. A government commission, led by the treacherous Count Holstein, a man who had once been Ludwig's friend but was now Luitpold's bagman, traveled by train and then by carriage to Neuschwanstein. They arrived in top hats and frock coats, carrying the Regency proclamation like a warrant. They expected the king to simply crumble. They severely underestimated the magic of the monarchy in the eyes of the common people. When the commissioners arrived at the village of Hohenschwangau, below the castle, they didn't find a cowering populace. They found a wall of human resistance. The local villagers, who knew Ludwig not as a madman, but as the generous, strange, beautiful figure who gave them employment and waved from his sleigh, were furious. The scene that unfolded was chaotic. The local fire brigade mobilized not to put out a fire, but to protect their king. Old peasant women armed with flails and pitchforks blocked the road. The local police sergeant, instead of obeying the orders from Munich, drew his sword and declared he would defend His Majesty against these traitors from the capital. Inside the castle, the mood shifted from confusion to apocalyptic fury. When Ludwig was told that a commission had arrived to depose him, he didn't weep. He raged. He ordered the castle gates barred. He reportedly demanded that the commissioners be seized and thrown into the dungeon, or perhaps flayed alive. For a few terrifying hours, it looked as though the 19th century was about to dissolve into a medieval siege. The commissioners, the men in the top hats representing the sane, rational government of Prince Luitpold, ended up humiliated, locked in a servant's room, and eventually chased away by the angry villagers. Back in Munich, when the telegrams arrived reporting this disaster, one can imagine the atmosphere in the Wittelsbachs Palais. Lesser men might have panicked. A failed coup is usually a death sentence. If Ludwig had managed to rally the army, or if he had fled across the border to Austria to raise support, Luitpold would have been finished. He would have gone down in history not as the Prince Regent, but as the traitor uncle who tried to usurp the throne. But Luitpold did not panic. This is where his decades of military discipline paid off. He knew that emotion had no place in the endgame. He knew that the king's resistance was brittle, fueled by hysteria and the loyalty of a few hundred unarmed peasants. It could not stand against the machinery of the modern state. Luitpold simply ordered the pressure to be increased. He mobilized the gendarmes. He ensured the telegraph lines to the castle were cut, isolating the king from the outside world. He replaced the local police with men loyal to the new regime. He did not scream. He did not rush to the scene. He simply waited for the inevitable crush of reality to destroy his nephew's fantasy. On June 11th, the second commission arrived. This time, there were no top hats. This time, there were doctors, asylum orderlies, keepers, as they were called, burly men chosen for their strength, and a hardened military escort. The village was pacified. The castle was infiltrated. The servants, realizing the wind had shifted, began to desert the king. The end came in the middle of a rainy, miserable night. The image is almost too cinematic to be real, yet it is historical fact. King Ludwig II, the builder of dream castles, was cornered in the tower of Neuschwanstein. The commissioners of sanity climbed the spiral stairs. Dr. Gooden, the man who had diagnosed him from a distance, finally stood face to face with his victim. Ludwig was composed. He was pale, exhausted, but lucid. He looked at the psychiatrist and asked the question that has echoed through history, a question that surely haunted Luitpold for the rest of his life. How can you declare me insane, Your Excellency, when you have not examined me and do not know me? There was no answer, of course. There didn't need to be. The decision had been made in Luitpold's office days ago. The diagnosis was not a medical conclusion. It was a political sentence. The king was led out of his castle at 4 a.m. on June 12th. He was placed in a carriage with the door handles removed from the inside. He was not treated as a sovereign. He was treated as a prisoner. As the carriage rattled down the mountain in the darkness, leaving the spires of Neuschwanstein behind forever, the king was weeping. He was being transported to Berg Castle, a smaller royal residence on the shores of Lake Starnberg, which had been hastily converted into a high-security asylum. While the carriage rolled through the Bavarian night, carrying the weeping king to his prison, Prince Luitpold was in Munich, accepting the oaths of allegiance from the army and the civil service. The transition was seamless. The newspapers, controlled by the government, were already printing the stories of the king's tragic decline and the heroic burden assumed by his uncle. Luitpold had won. The coup was technically a success. He held the capital, he held the army, and he held the king. But he had unleashed forces he could not entirely control. He had humiliated a man who saw himself as a god king. He had backed a proud, volatile, and desperate soul into a corner from which there was no dignified escape. The atmosphere at Berg Castle on June 13th, the day after the arrest, was suffocating. The castle had been transformed. Peepholes had been drilled into the doors of the king's majestic apartments, so the orderlies could watch him every second. The windows were barred. Dr. Gooden treated the 40-year-old monarch like a recalcitrant child, patronizing him, ordering him to eat, ordering him to sleep. But Ludwig was strangely calm. He seemed to have accepted his fate. He spoke politely to the doctor. He discussed his future life in captivity. He asked about the details of the regency. To Dr. Gooden, this was a sign that the treatment was working, that the maniac had been subdued. He sent a telegram to Luitpold in Munich. Everything is going remarkably well. It was the last mistake Dr. Gooden would ever make. Luitpold, reading that telegram in the safety of his palace, likely felt a wave of relief. The messy part was over. Now began the long, quiet management of the problem. He imagined a future where Ludwig lived on for decades, a silent prisoner at Berg, while he, Luitpold, ran the country. But Ludwig II had one final act of defiance left in him. He was a man who had lived his entire life constructing a narrative of beauty and sovereignty. He had built castles to block out the ugly reality of the world. Now, stripped of his crown, stripped of his dignity, locked in a room with peepholes, he was faced with a reality so stark, so ugly, that it was unbearable. The evening of June 13th was Whitsunday. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and damp. The lake was gray and still. Around 6 p.m., the king asked to take a walk in the park surrounding the castle. Dr. Gooden, confident in his authority and perhaps arrogant in his victory, agreed. He made a fatal error. He dismissed the orderlies. He told them he would walk alone with the king. "No escort is necessary," he said. They walked out of the castle gates and into the park. The king, a towering figure of over 6 feet 3 inches, walking beside the smaller, older doctor. They walked under the dripping ancient trees, heading towards the shore of Lake Starnberg. The guards watched them disappear into the twilight. They were expected back at 8 p.m. for supper. At 8 p.m., the rain began to fall again. The castle dining room was lit. The soup was hot, but the chairs were empty. At 8:30 p.m., anxiety began to ripple through the staff. Men were sent out into the park with lanterns, calling the king's name, Majesty, Excellency. The wind howled through the trees, extinguishing the lanterns. At 9 p.m., the anxiety turned to panic. A telegram was sent to Munich to Prince Luitpold. King and doctor missing. Searching park. One can only imagine the scene in Luitpold's study when that message arrived. The remarkably well of the morning had turned into the nightmare of the evening. The meticulous order that Luitpold cherished, the smooth transition of power he had engineered, was dissolving in the rain. Back at Berg, the search became desperate. The king's coat and jacket were found on a bench near the shore. Then marks were found in the mud, evidence of heavy footsteps, perhaps a struggle. And then peering out into the dark, shallow water of the lake, a searcher saw something floating. It was the king. He was drifting in waist-deep water, his coat ballooning around him. And nearby, the body of Dr. Gudden. They dragged the bodies to the shore. The king's watch had stopped at 6:54 p.m. There was no breath in him. The fairy tale king was dead. The man who had declared him insane was dead beside him. The official version was constructed almost immediately before the bodies were even dry. Suicide. The king, in a fit of madness, had rushed into the water to drown himself. The brave Dr. Gudden had tried to save him, and in the struggle the mad king had held the doctor under until they both perished. It was a neat, tragic ending that wrapped up all the loose ends. It confirmed the diagnosis of insanity. It made the doctor a martyr, and most importantly, it absolved Prince Luitpold of any direct guilt. But the physical evidence whispered a different, darker story. Why were there scratches on the king's face? Why was Dr. Gudden's face battered and bruised? Why, according to some witnesses who were quickly silenced, were there no water in the king's lungs, a sign that he had died before he inhaled the water? Why did some claim to hear shots fired from the bushes? The suicide theory was convenient. It was clean. It was the only story that allowed the government to survive. If the king had been murdered while trying to escape, or if he had been shot by a panicked guard, the regency would be born in blood. Luitpold could not rule as a murderer. He could only rule as a grieving uncle. So the silence descended. The bodies were moved. The autopsy was conducted by doctors loyal to the new regime, who dutifully found abnormalities in the king's brain to prove he was mad, though modern neurologists reviewing the notes find nothing of the sort. The witnesses were transferred to different posts or paid off. Luitpold attended the funeral in Munich, walking behind the coffin of the nephew he had deposed. The crowds were immense. They threw flowers. They wept for their Kini, their Swan King. Luitpold walked with his head bowed, his face a mask of solemn, impenetrable duty. He was now the undisputed master of Bavaria. The rival was gone. The obstacle was removed. But as the coffin was lowered into the crypt of the St. Michael's Church, Luitpold faced a new and grotesque reality. The coup had worked too well. Ludwig was dead. But the law of succession was clear. The crown did not pass to the uncle. It passed to the next brother. It passed to Otto. And Otto was not a romantic eccentric who built castles. Otto was a man who barked like a dog. Otto was a man who spent his days staring at the wall, terrified of invisible demons. Otto was genuinely, clinically, catastrophically insane. Luitpold had deposed a mad king who was actually quite lucid, only to find himself serving a sane king in the eyes of the law, who was completely mad. He had traded a difficult nephew for a broken one. The irony was Greek in its cruelty. Luitpold was now technically the regent for King Otto I. He had to swear allegiance to a man who didn't know his own name. He had to govern in the name of a ghost. This was the beginning of the great lie that would sustain the Bavarian state for the next quarter of a century. The lie that there was a king. The lie that Luitpold was just a helper. The lie that everything was normal. Luitpold moved quickly to secure the new king. Otto was already under care, but now the security had to be absolute. There could be no escapes, no walks by the lake, no commissions. Otto was moved to Fürstenried Palace, a hunting lodge surrounded by dense forests south of Munich. Luitpold ordered the walls raised. He ordered the windows barred. He created a court for Otto that was essentially a prison staff in livery. He visited his nephew, the new king, shortly after the accession. The meeting was brief. Otto sat in a corner, disheveled, muttering to himself, his eyes darting around the room, seeing terrors that weren't there. Luitpold, the field marshal, stood in his uniform, looking down at the wreckage of the Wittelsbachs bloodline. He didn't see a tragedy. He saw a solution. As long as Otto lived, and as long as Otto remained mad, Luitpold was the king, in all but name. He didn't need to usurp the throne. He just needed to keep the throne occupied by a phantom. The madness of the Wittelsbachs, which had been Luitpold's curse, was now his greatest political asset. And so, the Prince Regent time began. The era of the shadow regent. Luitpold went back to Munich, to his office in the Palais. He dipped his pen in ink, black ink, not purple, and began to sign the decrees that would modernize Bavaria. He authorized the building of roads, the funding of universities, the reform of the electoral laws. He began the work of being the good father of the country. But every document he signed, every law he passed, bore the header, "In the name of His Majesty, King Otto I." It was a fiction that everyone in Bavaria agreed to believe. The newspapers stopped talking about the dead Ludwig. They stopped asking questions about the lake. They printed glowing reports of the Prince Regent's hunting trips. They printed respectful updates on King Otto's fragile health. The silence settled over Bavaria like a heavy snowfall. The fairy tale was over. The age of the bureaucrat had arrived. But deep in the woods, at Fürstenried, the true king of Bavaria was scratching at the walls, and the ghost of the drowned king was waiting in the crypt. And Luitpold, the man of stone, sat in the middle of it all, ruling a kingdom built on a grave and a prison cell. The years that followed the death of Ludwig II and the confinement of King Otto I are remembered in Bavarian history as the Prince Regentenzeit, the Prince Regent era. In the collective memory of the Bavarian people, this period is bathed in a golden nostalgic light. It is remembered as a long summer afternoon before the violent thunderstorms of the 20th century rolled in. It was a time of peace, a time of prosperity, a time when Munich transformed itself into one of the cultural capitals of the world. But this golden age was built entirely on a foundation of silence and calculated performance. It was a masterpiece of stagecraft, directed by the old soldier in the Wittelsbachs Palais. Prince Regent Luitpold understood instinctively that after the erratic, high-voltage drama of Ludwig II, the people of Bavaria were exhausted. They didn't want another genius. They didn't want another builder of fairy tale castles. They wanted normalcy. They wanted a father. And so Luitpold gave them exactly what they needed. He crafted a public persona that was the polar opposite of his dead nephew. Ludwig had been elusive, a ghost who fled from human contact. Luitpold made himself the most visible man in the kingdom. He was everywhere. His daily routine became the metronome by which Munich set its clocks. He rose every morning at 5 a.m., military hours. He took a cold bath, ate a simple breakfast, and went to work at his desk processing state papers with the efficiency of a quartermaster. but it was his behavior outside the palace that cemented his legend. Luitpold began to walk through the streets of Munich. This was a radical departure from the protocol of the time. Kings and regents did not simply stroll. They were driven in carriages. They were surrounded by guards. They were separated from the rabble. But Luitpold, often dressed in the simple green hunting jacket and leather shorts of a Bavarian countryman, with a cigar clamped firmly between his teeth, would walk through the English garden or down the Ludwigstrasse. He walked with a singular lack of pretension. When ordinary citizens doffed their hats to him, the Prince Regent would tip his hat back. He stopped to talk to shopkeepers. He patted dogs. He bought roasted chestnuts from street vendors. He handed out cigars to soldiers he met on patrol. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. After decades of a king who hid in the mountains and refused to be seen, the Bavarians suddenly had a ruler who was physically present, who breathed the same air, who walked the same pavements. He became Papa Luitpold. The nickname stuck because it felt true. He was the grandfather of the nation, stern but benevolent, frugal but generous, accessible but dignified. He became a marketing icon before the concept of marketing existed. His face, with that magnificent flowing white beard, began to appear on beer steins, on snuff boxes, on postcards. He was the living logo of Bavarian identity. He represented the good old days while they were still happening. But beneath the grandfatherly charm lay the steel of the autocrat. Luitpold's simplicity was a political weapon. By presenting himself as a humble man of the people, he immunized himself against the criticism that he was a usurper. How could this kindly old man who liked to hunt chamois and drink beer be a villain? How could the man who gave candy to children be the same man who had locked his nephew in a padded room? While Luitpold charmed the streets, he allowed his ministers to modernize the state. This is the great paradox of his reign. Luitpold himself was an arch-conservative. He hated liberalism. He distrusted socialists. He was a pious Catholic who believed in the divine order of things. And yet he presided over one of the most liberal eras in German history. He did this because he was a pragmatist. He knew that to keep the Wittelsbachs dynasty secure, he had to keep the peace. So he allowed the Liberal Party to dominate the government. He allowed the press a degree of freedom that was unthinkable in Berlin or Vienna. He allowed Munich to become a haven for the avant-garde, for artists and writers who were pushing the boundaries of morality and taste. Munich in the 1890s was electric. It was the city of Jugendstil, Art Nouveau. It was the city of Thomas Mann, of Wassily Kandinsky, of Rainer Maria Rilke. The satirical magazine Simplicissimus, which ruthlessly mocked the Kaiser and the military, was published in Munich. In Prussia, the editors would have been thrown in jail. In Luitpold's Bavaria, they were tolerated, barely, but tolerated. Luitpold himself had absolutely no taste for modern art. He preferred traditional paintings of deer in the forest or glorious battles. When he visited the exhibitions of the Munich Secession, the rebel artists who were redefining modern painting, he would walk through the galleries with his hands clasped behind his back, muttering, "I don't understand it, but if it brings money to Munich, it is good." If it brings money to Munich, that was the mantra. Luitpold was the CEO of Bavaria Inc. He stabilized the finances that Ludwig had wrecked. He courted tourism. He encouraged industry. He transformed the monarchy from a romantic crusade into a profitable business. But while the electric trams rattled down the illuminated boulevards of Munich, and the artists drank absinthe in the cafes of Schwabing, discussing the death of God, a very different reality was playing out just a few miles to the south. At Fürstenried Palace, the time had stopped. If Munich was the city of light, Fürstenried was the fortress of shadow. It was here that King Otto I, the rightful sovereign of this booming kingdom, was serving his life sentence. The contrast between the Prince Regent's public vitality and the king's private living death was grotesque. Luitpold ensured that Otto was kept invisible. The public was told that the king was resting, that his health was delicate. In reality, Otto was existing in a state of torment that modern psychiatry would struggle to treat, let alone the primitive alienness of the 19th century. Otto's world was confined to a suite of rooms on the ground floor of the palace, opening onto a high-walled garden where no one could see in. The king, now in his late 30s and early 40s, had physically deteriorated. He was a heavy smoker, consuming chain cigarettes until his fingers were stained yellow. He often refused to wash, terrified of the water. He wore ragged clothes, tearing off anything new that was put on him. His behavior was erratic and often terrifying to his staff. He would spend days staring at a spot on the wall, conversing with invisible entities. He would bark like a dog. He would smash the crockery. At other times, he would fall into a catatonic stupor, sitting motionless like a stone statue for hours on end. But the most tragic aspect of Otto's confinement was the moments of lucidity. There were times, rare but heartbreaking, when the fog would lift. The king would remember who he was. He would ask about his brother Ludwig. He would ask why he was locked up. He would demand to see his ministers. In those moments, the staff at Fürstenried had strict instructions. They were to soothe him, to distract him, but never to obey him. The fiction had to be maintained. The king was mad. Therefore, anything he said was madness. If he demanded his rights, it was a symptom of his disease. Luitpold created a shadow court for Otto. A group of aristocratic courtiers was assigned to wait on the king. They were paid handsomely to essentially be high-class jailers. They wore the royal livery. They bowed when the king entered the room, even if the king was screaming at the ceiling. They set a place for him at the head of the table, with silver cutlery and crystal glasses. Even if the king ate with his hands or threw the food on the floor, it was a cruel pantomime. It was a play performed for an audience of one, designed to strip the king of his agency while preserving the illusion of his sovereignty. And overseeing it all, from a distance, was Uncle Luitpold. He received daily reports from the doctors at Fürstenried. He knew exactly how many cigarettes Otto smoked, how many times he screamed in the night, how many plates he broke. Luitpold visited Fürstenried rarely. It is said that he found the visits distressing. One can imagine why. To look into the face of Otto was to look into the face of the crime that sustained Luitpold's power. It was the picture of Dorian Gray in reverse. The regent remained beautiful and beloved in the public eye, while the hidden king bore all the scars and ugliness of the dynasty's corruption. Yet Luitpold never wavered. He never sought to have Otto declared cured. In fact, the medical treatment Otto received was purely custodial. There was no therapy. There was no attempt at rehabilitation. The doctors were there to keep him alive, not to make him well. A dead king would mean a succession crisis. A cured king would mean Luitpold lost his job. The sweet spot was a living, breathing, incurable madman. To ensure this status quo, the medical commission became an annual ritual of the state. Once a year, a carriage would arrive at Fürstenried carrying the Minister of Justice and a panel of senior psychiatrists. They were there to fulfill the constitutional requirement of verifying the king's incapacity. The procedure was a farce. They would be led to a viewing window or a doorway. They would observe the king for perhaps 10 minutes, Often the staff would agitate Otto beforehand, ensuring he was in a state of distress when the commission arrived. The doctors would nod, make notes in their leather-bound books, and then retire to the antechamber to sign the renewal of the regency. They would then return to Munich, to the bright lights and the beer halls, and issue a solemn statement. His Majesty's condition remains unchanged. The regency must continue for the good of the state. And the people of Munich, reading this over their morning coffee and pretzels, would nod and say, "Thank God for Papa Luitpold." As the years turned into decades, a strange psychological transfer took place. The people began to forget that Otto was the king at all. He became an abstraction, a legal technicality. Luitpold became the true monarch in their hearts. He celebrated his 70th birthday, then his 80th, then his 90th. He became immortal. He was the oldest ruler in Europe. He had outlived his brothers, his wife, many of his children. He had outlived Bismarck. He was a living relic of a vanishing world. His birthdays became national holidays. The entire city of Munich would be draped in blue and white flags. Torchlight processions with thousands of students and soldiers would march past the Wittelsbachs Palais, singing hymns to the regent. Luitpold would stand on the balcony, a tiny figure with a white beard, waving mechanically. Did he feel the weight of the lie? There are glimpses that he did. Late in his life, Luitpold began to spend more time in the chapel. He was seen praying with an intensity that unsettled his aides. He gave massive sums of his private fortune to charity, to orphanages, to hospitals, to the poor. Was this simple piety, or was it penance? Was he trying to buy his way out of purgatory? He had saved the kingdom, yes. He had made the house of Wittelsbach richer and more secure than it had been in centuries. He had navigated the treacherous politics of the German Empire, keeping the arrogant Kaiser Wilhelm II at arm's length and preserving Bavaria's dignity. But he had done it by sacrificing his own blood. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but spiritually true, that in the deep silence of the Wittelsbach Palais, Luitpold kept a locked drawer in his desk. Inside were the last letters written by Ludwig II before his death, letters that accused his uncle of treason, letters that cursed the family. Luitpold never destroyed them. He kept them, perhaps as a reminder, perhaps as a talisman. As the 20th century dawned, the shadows around the Golden Age began to lengthen. The world was becoming harder, faster, more violent. The industrialized nationalism of the German Reich was pulling Bavaria into its orbit. The arms race was beginning. Luitpold, the man of the 19th century, looked out at this new world with old, tired eyes. He knew his time was ending. He knew that when he died, the fragile construct he had built would be tested. His son, Prince Ludwig, the future Ludwig III, was waiting in the wings. He was already an old man himself, having waited for the throne almost as long as his father. The Prince Regent time could not last forever. The biology of the dynasty was failing. In 1911, a year before Luitpold's death, the cracks began to show. The sheer absurdity of the situation, a 90-year-old regent ruling for a 60-year-old madman, was becoming politically dangerous. There were murmurs in the parliament. Why continue the charade? Why not just depose Otto and be done with it? Luitpold resisted. To the very end, he resisted the final step. He had taken the regency, but he refused to take the crown. He clung to the legal fiction as if it were the only thing saving his soul. As long as Otto was king, Luitpold was just a servant. If he took the crown, he was a usurper. It was a distinction that mattered only to him. But nature does not care for legal fictions. In December 1912, the Prince Regent caught a cold. It settled in his chest. Bronchitis set in. The great strong heart that had beaten steadily through the Napoleonic Wars, the unification of Germany, and the tragedy of the Starnberg Lake began to falter. The city of Munich held its breath. Straw was laid down on the streets outside the palace to dampen the sound of carriage wheels. The churches were full. On his deathbed, surrounded by his kneeling family, the 91-year-old patriarch was reported to be lucid to the end. He looked at his son Ludwig. He looked at the future, and he gave his final orders. He did not speak of love. He did not speak of God. He spoke of the state. He spoke of the secret. "Do not let go," he reportedly whispered. "Hold it together." He died on December 12th, 1912. The spell was broken. The Prince Regent time was over. The grandfather was gone, and the children of Bavaria were suddenly alone in a darkening room. The death of Prince Regent Luitpold in December 1912 was not merely the passing of an old man. It was the removing of a keystroke from the very architecture of the Bavarian state. For 26 years, his physical presence, that white beard, that hunter's hat, that unwavering grandfatherly stability, had acted as a suspension of disbelief. He had allowed the people to ignore the grotesque reality of their constitution. He had made the lie comfortable. But when the funeral cortege wound its way through the snowy streets of Munich, past the weeping crowds and the muffled drums, a new and colder wind began to blow through the Wittelsbachs dynasty. The buffer was gone. The Prince Regent time was officially dead. Now the kingdom had to face the future, and the future was wearing the face of Luitpold's son, Prince Ludwig. Ludwig, who would soon become King Ludwig III, was a very different creature from his father. At 67 years old, he was already an old man when he inherited the regency. He had spent his entire life waiting in the wings, a prince in waiting for a throne that seemed permanently out of reach. While Luitpold had been the charismatic, effortless autocrat, Ludwig was stiff, serious, and deeply unglamorous. History has been unkind to Ludwig III, often dismissing him as the dairy farmer king, Millibauer, because of his genuine passion for agriculture and cattle breeding. He was a man who preferred the barn to the ballroom. He lacked his father's instinctive grasp of public relations. Luitpold would walk the streets and hand out cigars. Ludwig would lecture ministers on the milk yield of a prize cow. He was intelligent, certainly, and deeply pious, but he lacked the magic. And in a monarchy that was sustained by a fairy tale illusion, the loss of magic was a fatal vulnerability. Almost immediately after Luitpold's funeral, the political atmosphere in Munich began to curdle. The Otto problem, which Luitpold had managed with such delicate hypocrisy for a quarter of a century, suddenly became a glaring absurdity. Under Luitpold, the fiction of serving the mad King Otto possessed a certain tragic nobility, a selfless act by a loyal uncle. But with Luitpold gone, the tragedy curdled into farce. The people were no longer watching a sacrifice. They were witnessing a bureaucratic absurdity that no longer held any moral weight. The newspapers, emboldened by the regime change, began to ask the dangerous question, why continue the charade? The state didn't need a ghost. It needed a king who could sign laws, lead the army, and above all, be sane. Ludwig III felt this pressure acutely. Unlike his father, who had been content to rule from the shadows, Ludwig III had a touch of vanity. He wanted the title. He felt perhaps justifiably that the Wittelsbach dynasty could not survive the 20th century if it remained headless. The rising tide of socialism, the aggressive posturing of Prussia, the diplomatic tensions of Europe, these required a strong, legitimate monarch, not a permanent substitute. And so in the fateful year of 1913, the machinery of the final betrayal was set in motion. It was a slow-motion coup d'etat, executed not with swords, but with fountain pens and parliamentary committees. The plan was to amend the Bavarian constitution. The constitution, written in 1818, had no provision for deposing a king due to illness. It assumed that a regency would be temporary, that the king would either recover or die. It had never anticipated a king like Otto, physically healthy, virtually immortal, but mentally obliterated. Ludwig III's ministers, working in the smoke-filled rooms of the Landtag, the parliament, proposed a new clause. It was a piece of legalistic surgery designed to kill a reign without killing the man. The clause stated that if a regency had lasted for more than 10 years, and if there was no medical hope of the king's recovery, the regent could declare the regency ended and assume the crown himself. It was a pragmatic solution. It was a rational solution, but it was also a profound violation of the mystical principle of monarchy. If a parliament could vote to remove a king because he was inconvenient, then the king was no longer chosen by God. He was essentially an employee who could be fired for incompetence. The debate in Munich was intense. The conservatives, the old guard who remembered the sacred vows of 1886, were horrified. They argued that loyalty to King Otto was a test of Bavarian honor. To depose him was to break the holy oath sworn to the Wittelsbachs bloodline. But the liberals, the industrialists, and the pragmatists won the day. They argued that Bavaria could not afford to be a museum of madness. Throughout the spring and summer of 1913, while the lawyers drafted the text that would strip him of his crown, King Otto remained at Fürstenried Palace, utterly oblivious. The reports from his court during this time are heartbreaking in their banality. The king was eating well. The king had broken a vase. The king had spent 3 hours staring at the pattern on the carpet. The king had smoked 40 cigarettes. He was the eye of the hurricane, the calm, empty center around which the political storm raged. He was the subject of every conversation in the capital, yet he had not spoken a meaningful sentence in 30 years. In November 1913, the deed was done. The Parliament passed the constitutional amendment. The Senate ratified it. The path was clear. On November 5, 1913, the shadow reign of King Otto I came to its legal end. A proclamation was read from the balcony of the royal palace in Munich. It declared that the regency was over. It declared that Prince Regent Ludwig was now His Majesty, King Ludwig III of Bavaria. The crowds cheered. The cannons fired a salute. The church bells rang across the city. On the surface, it was a moment of celebration. Bavaria had a king again. The anomaly was resolved. The dynasty was secure. But the scene at Fürstenried Palace on that same day offers a darker counterpoint to the jubilation in the capital. A delegation was sent to the palace to inform the former king of his deposition. One wonders what they expected. Did they expect a protest? A moment of clarity? They found Otto in his usual rooms, perhaps wearing the oversized, disheveled clothes he preferred. The courtiers, men who had bowed to him as Your Majesty for decades, now had to perform a delicate linguistic gymnastics. They had to inform him that he was no longer king, but merely Prince Otto. They had to tell him that his cousin was now his sovereign. The tragedy is that it didn't matter. Otto didn't understand. He likely didn't even look up. The concept of king or prince or regent had vanished from his mind decades ago, replaced by the terrifying, vivid hallucinations that were his only reality. He was stripped of his crown without ever knowing he had lost it, just as he had worn it for 27 years without ever knowing he possessed it. He was allowed to keep his residence at Fürstenried. He was allowed to keep his doctors and his servants. The only thing that changed was the stationery and the prayers in the church. The priests stopped praying for King Otto and started praying for King Ludwig. But for the new king, Ludwig III, the victory was Pyrrhic. He had the crown, yes? He sat on the throne in the residence. He wore the ermine and the velvet, but he had acquired it through a bureaucratic maneuver that left a sour taste in the mouths of many traditional Bavarians. There was a feeling, whispered in the beer halls and the sacristies, that this was hubris. Luitpold had been wise enough to leave the crown alone, to respect the tragedy of his nephew. Ludwig III had grasped for it. And in folklore, grasping for a crown you do not strictly inherit is often a prelude to disaster. The coronation of Ludwig III was a subdued affair compared to the grand pageants of the past. There was a sense of fatigue. The golden age of the Prince Regent was fading, replaced by a grittier, more anxious reality. The year was turning towards 1914. King Ludwig III, the farmer king, threw himself into his duties with an almost desperate energy. He traveled the country, he opened agricultural fairs, he inspected regiments, he tried to build a connection with his people, but he was fighting against the ghosts of his predecessors. He wasn't the beautiful, tragic Ludwig II. He wasn't the beloved, grandfatherly Luitpold. He was just Ludwig, an elderly man in a uniform that seemed a little too tight, ruling a kingdom that was drifting towards the precipice. And while Ludwig III inspected his troops and signed his papers, the great geopolitical plates of Europe were grinding together. The assassination in Sarajevo was only months away. The complex web of alliances that Luitpold had feared, the entanglement with Prussia, the hostility with France, was tightening into a noose. Bavaria, which had fought so hard for its independence, which had deposed a king to save its state, was about to be dragged into a war that wasn't of its making. The army that Luitpold had modernized, the army that Ludwig III now commanded, was not going to defend the Alps. It was going to be fed into the meat grinder of the Western Front. The irony is profound. The Wittelsbachs had spent the 19th century obsessing over their own family dramas. The madness, the spending, the castles, the successions. They had treated the kingdom as a stage for their dynastic opera. Luitpold and Ludwig III had maneuvered with supreme cunning to ensure that the right Wittelsbach sat on the throne, but they had been playing chess while the house was catching fire. As the winter of 1913 turned into the spring of 1914, Munich was still a city of art and pleasure. The cafes were full. The opera house was sold out. The artists of the Blue Rider group were painting their abstract masterpieces. But if you listened closely, you could hear the rumble of the trains moving north, the trains carrying guns, the trains carrying the youth of Bavaria towards a conflict that would make the tragedies of Ludwig II and Otto look like a nursery rhyme. In Fürstenried, the deposed Otto continued his silent vigil. He walked in his walled garden, barking at the moon, ghosts his only companions. He was the only Wittelsbach who was safe. The madness that had imprisoned him also protected him. He didn't know about Serbia. He didn't know about the Kaiser. He didn't know that the world was about to commit suicide. He was the king of nothing, and therefore he had nothing left to lose. But his cousin, the new King Ludwig III, had everything to lose, and he was about to lose it all. The stage was set for the final act. The curtain was rising on the catastrophe, and the man who had waited 67 years to be king would find that his reign was not a golden autumn, but a violent, bloody winter. The summer of 1914 was the last time the sun shone on the old Bavaria. In the photographs of that July, Munich looks like a city at the peak of its civilization. The cafes were spilling onto the sidewalks. The ladies wore vast hats adorned with ostrich feathers, and the beer gardens were full of men in checkered shirts discussing the harvest and the opera. King Ludwig III, the man who had waited 67 years to wear the crown, must have felt that finally the turbulent waters of the Wittelsbach history had calmed. He had the throne. The Otto problem had been legally resolved. The economy was booming. The harvest looked promising, but in the distant capitals of Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, the telegrams were flying and the mobilization orders were being typed. When the declaration of war came in August 1914, it didn't arrive in Munich as a tragedy. It arrived as a delirium. A mass psychosis swept the city just as it swept Paris and London. On the Odeonsplatz, a vast crowd gathered to cheer the announcement. In the middle of that crowd, captured in a photograph that would become one of the most famous images of the 20th century, was a young, failed Austrian painter named Adolf Hitler, his face glowing with fanatic enthusiasm. For Ludwig III, this was the moment of truth. He appeared on the balcony of the royal palace, the Wittelsbach lion, on his crest. He spoke of duty, of the German fatherland, of God and honor. The crowd roared. For a brief shining moment, the Millibauer, the dairy farmer king, was a hero. He was the warrior king, leading his people to a glorious, short, and victorious defense of the realm. But the reality of the war exposed the fatal flaw in Luitpold's life's work. Luitpold had spent decades trying to maintain Bavarian independence while staying friendly with Prussia. He had tried to be a partner, not a subordinate. But the moment the first shot was fired, the illusion of Bavarian sovereignty evaporated. The Bavarian army, the pride of the Wittelsbachs, the army Luitpold had inspected 1,000 times, was immediately swallowed by the Prussian High Command. The orders came from Berlin, not Munich. The strategy was decided by Prussian generals who viewed Bavarian soldiers as useful cannon fodder. Brave, certainly, but expendable shock troops. Ludwig III, the King of Bavaria, became little more than a recruiting sergeant for the Kaiser. He signed the mobilization papers that sent the sons of the Bavarian farmers, his favorite people, into the meat grinder of Lorraine and Flanders. The short and glorious war did not happen. The autumn leaves fell, and the soldiers did not return. Then the snows came, the trenches were dug, the machine guns were set up, and the telegrams began to arrive in the villages of the Alps, not bringing news of victory, but black-bordered notifications of death. As 1914 bled into 1915, and 1915 dragged into the hell of 1916, the mood in Bavaria shifted from euphoria to a grim, silent depression. The war was eating the kingdom alive. And amidst this global slaughter, a quiet, almost unnoticed death took place that marked the spiritual end of the old dynasty. On October 11, 1916, in the fortress-like isolation of Fürstenried Palace, the Shadow King finally slipped away. Otto I, the man who had been the hollow center of the Bavarian state for 30 years, died of a volvulus, a twisted intestine. He died as he had lived, alone, terrified, and misunderstood. He was 68 years old. He had spent more than half his life in captivity. He never knew about the trenches. He never knew about the mustard gas. He never knew that the Europe of kings and emperors was burning to the ground. His death was a strange, muted footnote in the middle of the apocalypse. There was no grand state funeral for Otto. How could there be? The streets were filled with wounded veterans, missing arms and legs. There was no money for black crepe and silver carriages. The people were too busy queuing for bread to mourn a king they had already forgotten. Otto was buried in the crypt of St. Michael's Church next to his brother Ludwig II. The two brothers, the dreamer and the madman, were reunited in the dark. The fairy tale generation of the Wittelsbachs was now entirely extinct. Only the bureaucrats were left. With Otto gone, Ludwig III was now the undisputed singular king. There were no more ghosts to hide behind. He had to bear the full weight of the catastrophe alone, and he was failing. By 1917, the British naval blockade was strangling Germany. Bavaria, a land of plenty, began to starve. The turnip winter arrived. There was no meat, no butter, no flour. People boiled turnips for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The coffee was made from roasted acorns. The beer, the sacred blood of Bavaria, became watery and weak. Hunger is a powerful political solvent. It dissolves loyalty. It dissolves fear. It dissolves tradition. As the Bavarian mothers watched their children grow thin, their anger needed a target. It couldn't easily reach the distant Kaiser in Berlin or the generals at the front, but it could reach the old man in the residence palace in Munich. The rumors began to swirl, vicious, unfounded, poisonous rumors. They whispered that while the people starved, the king's prized dairy cows were being fed the best grain. They whispered that the king was selling his milk to Prussia for a profit while Bavarian babies went without. It was a lie. Ludwig III was a decent man who ate the same war rations as his ministers. But the Millibauer nickname, once affectionately mocking, became a slur. He wasn't the farmer king anymore. He was the butter profiteer. Ludwig III seemed paralyzed by the tragedy. He was an old man, now nearly 70. He retreated further into his agricultural obsession, perhaps because it was the only thing he could control. While the front lines collapsed, he wrote memos about potato cultivation and nitrogen fertilizers. To the people, this looked like senility. It looked like callousness. The bond between the Wittelsbachs and the people, a bond that had survived wars, plagues, and madness for 738 years, was snapping. The final unraveling began in the late summer of 1918. The German spring offensive had failed. The Americans had arrived with fresh troops and unlimited supplies. The German army was broken. In Munich, the atmosphere was electric with sedition. The soldiers returning from the front were not the starry-eyed boys of 1914. They were hardened, embittered men with hollow eyes. They brought back stories of the incompetence of the officers, the senseless slaughter, and the lie of the glorious war. They gathered in the beer halls, not to sing hymns to the king, but to listen to new voices. Voices like Kurt Eisner. Eisner was an unlikely revolutionary. He was a Jewish intellectual from Berlin with a wild beard and a thick pair of glasses. He looked more like a librarian than a Lenin, but he possessed a fiery oratory style that captivated the war-weary crowds. He spoke the unthinkable. He said that the king was an obstacle to peace. He said that the Wittelsbachs had sold Bavaria to Prussia. He said that the only way to end the suffering was to overthrow the monarchy. In the palaces, the court was in a state of sleepwalking denial. They knew there was unrest, yes, but they believed in the myth of the good Bavarian people. They believed that the Bavarians were too conservative, too Catholic, too loyal to ever truly revolt. A revolution might happen in Berlin, the ministers told each other, sipping their acorn coffee, but never in Munich. We are a family. They were wrong. They were judging the 1918 population by the standards of 1886. They didn't realize that the war had destroyed the old social contract. On November 3rd, 1918, the sailors in Kiel mutinied. The spark had been struck. The fire spread instantly across Germany, jumping from city to city like a contagion. On November 7th, 1918, the annihilation arrived in Munich. It was a Thursday. The weather was mild and foggy. King Ludwig III took his usual afternoon walk in the English garden. He saw nothing unusual. He returned to the residence, had a light dinner, and prepared to go to bed early. He was suffering from asthma and the fatigue of age, but a few miles away, on the Theresienwiese, the vast open ground where the Oktoberfest is held, a massive crowd had gathered. 60,000 people, workers, soldiers, women, students. Kurt Eisner climbed onto a makeshift podium. He didn't call for a protest. He called for a revolution. The Wittelsbachs have forfeited their right to rule, he shouted into the fog. Long live the Free State of Bavaria. The crowd roared, and then they began to move. It wasn't a battle. It was a liquidation. The crowd marched towards the barracks of the Munich garrison. The officers tried to order their men to shoot. The soldiers refused. They turned their rifles upside down. They tore the royal insignias off their uniforms. They joined the march. The avalanche rolled towards the city center. It captured the railway station. It captured the telegraph office. It captured the Parliament building. There was almost no resistance. The police vanished. The royal guards melted away. Inside the residence, the silence was terrifying. The king was unaware of the scale of the disaster until the very last moment. His ministers had fled. The telephone lines were dead. Around 7 p.m., a loyal servant rushed into the king's chambers. He was breathless, panicked. "Your Majesty," he gasped, "the red flag is flying over the city. The mob is coming." Ludwig III looked at him, uncomprehending. "But the army?" he asked. "The army is with them, Majesty." The king stood up. He was 73 years old. He was the heir of a dynasty that had ruled since the year 1180. He had thought he would die in his bed surrounded by weeping subjects, just like his father Luitpold. Instead, he was told he had 10 minutes to pack a bag. There were no gilded carriages waiting. There was no military escort. The king, his wife Queen Maria Theresa, who was ill and could barely walk, and his daughters were bundled into a rented car. The driver was terrified. They had to leave immediately before the mob surrounded the palace. The car slipped out of a side gate of the residence just as the first revolutionaries were breaching the main entrance. They drove into the foggy night, heading south toward the mountains, towards the Austrian border. The King of Bavaria was running for his life. Behind him, in the great halls of the residence, the revolutionaries were wandering through the empty rooms. They marveled at the gold, the tapestries, the portraits of the ancestors. They walked into the king's study. The ink on his desk was still wet. In the beer halls, the beer was flowing again, but the toasts were different now. Down with the Millibauer. Long live the Republic. The impossible had happened. The structure that Prince Regent Luitpold had built with such care, the structure he had sacrificed his conscience and his family to preserve, had not just cracked. It had disintegrated into dust in a single afternoon. The long, slow suicide of the House of Wittelsbach, which began with a doctor's diagnosis in 1886, was finally complete. The shadow that Luitpold had cast over the throne had finally been lifted, only to reveal that there was no throne left at all. The flight of King Ludwig III from Munich on the night of November 7th, 1918, was a sordid, humiliating affair that seemed to mock 7 centuries of history. There was no Wagnerian soundtrack, no grand Gotterdammerung fire. There was just a rented car skidding on icy roads, a sick queen coughing in the back seat, and a bewildered old man wondering why his people, the people he had tried to feed with his own milk and potatoes, were hunting him. They fled across the border to Austria, finding refuge in Anif Palace near Salzburg. It was here, on November 12, 1918, that the final legal act of the Kingdom of Bavaria took place. It wasn't a dramatic abdication signed in blood. Ludwig III, stubborn to the end, refused to technically abdicate. He refused to say, "I am no longer king." Instead, he signed the Anif Declaration, a document in which he released all civil servants and soldiers from their oaths of loyalty. It was a bureaucrat's end to a dynasty. He didn't quit. He just stopped giving orders. Back in Munich, the Republic was proclaimed. Kurt Eisner, the revolutionary with the spectacles, dreamed of a socialist utopia, but the violence that Luitpold had kept at bay for so long had finally broken the dam. 3 months later, Eisner was assassinated, shot in the back by a right-wing aristocrat while walking to Parliament. Munich descended into chaos. A Soviet republic was declared. Red Guards executed hostages. Then the White Guards, the Freikorps, stormed the city, massacring the communists. The peaceful, happy Munich of Papa Luitpold was now a slaughterhouse. The streets where Luitpold had tipped his hat to smiling citizens were now stained with blood and scarred by machine gun fire. In exile, the former King Ludwig III wandered like a ghost. He moved to Hungary, living on the charity of minor nobility. His wife, Queen Maria Theresa, died in 1919 heartbroken and exhausted. Ludwig lingered on for 2 more years, a sad, broken figure in a tweed suit, wandering the Hungarian plains, far from his beloved Bavarian cows. He died on October 18, 1921. But history had one final surreal twist left for the Wittelsbachs. In 1921, the revolutionary fervor in Bavaria had burned itself out, replaced by a deep nostalgic melancholia. The Republic was unstable. The people were poor, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, and terrified of the Bolsheviks. Suddenly they remembered their old kings. They remembered the stability. They remembered the gold. When Ludwig III's body was brought back to Munich for burial, the Republican government, terrified of offending the monarchist sentiments of the populace, allowed a state funeral. It was a spectacle that defied logic. The king, who had been chased out of the city like a criminal 3 years earlier, was welcomed back like a saint. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets. The bells of the Frauenkirche tolled. The old aristocracy put on their uniforms one last time. Crown Prince Ruprecht, Ludwig's son, walked behind the coffin looking for all the world like the rightful king. For one day the ghost of the monarchy rose from the grave, but it was only a ghost. Standing in the crowd that day, watching the pageantry with cold, calculating eyes, were men like Adolf Hitler and Erich Ludendorff. They saw the hunger for a strong man. They saw the deep desire for order. They realized that the void left by Luitpold and his descendants was a vacuum waiting to be filled. Luitpold had taught the Bavarians to love a father figure. Now that the true father was gone, they would soon turn to a monster. So what is the legacy of the Shadow Regent? What remains of the man who ruled for 26 years without a crown? If you go to Munich today, you see his name everywhere. The Prince Regentenstrasse is still one of the grandest boulevards in Europe. The Prince Regententorte is still delicious. The statues still stand, collecting pigeon droppings and the indifference of passers-by. But the true legacy of Prince Luitpold is found in the silence of Fürstenried Palace. The palace where King Otto was buried alive for decades is now a retreat center and a seminary. It is a quiet place. The high walls are still there. If you walk in the gardens, you can almost feel the weight of the years of confinement. This was the laboratory of the perfect crime. Luitpold's life asks us a terrible question. What is the price of sanity? Luitpold was the sane one. He was the rational man. He looked at Ludwig II's debts and Otto's hallucinations and said, "This must stop." He chose the budget over the dream. He chose political stability over family loyalty. He chose the real world over the fantasy. And what did his sanity achieve? He built a strong, militarized, efficient state that marched obediently into the trenches of World War I. He saved the treasury so it could be looted by the war effort. He preserved the dynasty just long enough for it to be scapegoated for the collapse of Germany. In contrast, look at the mad king, Ludwig II. He bankrupted the state to build useless castles in the mountains. He ignored the army. He lived in a fantasy world of swans and knights. And yet today, millions of people travel from every corner of the earth to stand before Neuschwanstein Castle. They don't come to see the barracks Luitpold built. They don't come to see the railway timetables of the Regency. They come to see the dream. Ludwig's madness gave the world something eternal. Luitpold's sanity gave the world a 20-year pause before the apocalypse. History has cast its final vote. The shadow regent won the battle for power in his lifetime, but he lost the war for immortality. In the end, the story of Luitpold is a tragedy of good intentions. He was not a villain in the theatrical sense. He was not Richard III. He was a man who believed that duty was the highest virtue. He believed that if you just followed the rules, if you just managed the accounts, if you just kept the crazy people locked away, the world would make sense. He was wrong. The world does not make sense. The world is wild and tragic and ungovernable. He spent 26 years holding the door shut against the chaos. He held it shut with his prestige, his beard, his grandfatherly smile, and his iron will. But the moment he died, the door burst open and the 20th century rushed in. The region of shadows ultimately became a shadow himself. He is the man who kept the seat warm for disaster. He is the caretaker who polished the silver on the Titanic. And somewhere in the dark damp of the St. Michael's crypt, where Luitpold lies, just a few feet away from the nephew he deposed and the nephew he imprisoned, one can imagine a final bitter reconciliation. The dreamer, the madman, and the regent. 3 men who tried, in their own broken ways, to hold on to a crown